Okay,
Hello.
I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to ICOF's quarterly peer learning call. I'm Michelle Wallstrom, the ICOF Community Foundation Services Coordinator. Thank you all for joining us today to hear from some of your colleagues about their learnings at conferences they have attended this year. During today's conference Shareback call, we will hear from 4 colleagues sharing information that they feel would be beneficial for others in this community foundation field. This allows all of us to benefit from these educational opportunities without all of the hassle of traveling to them. So on our call today, we will hear from Carla Tweed-Ball, Senior Vice President, Programs and Community Investment of the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation, who will share with us some beneficial information she learned from attending the Council on Foundation Inclusive Economies Conference earlier this fall. Then Anna Naline, Director of Nonprofit Relations for the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines, will talk with us about some of the highlights from the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations Conference she attended in May. And then we will have 2 colleagues share their learnings from the National Conference for Growing Community Foundations, which was held last month in Kansas. Cindy Sweet, Executive Director of the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, and Rob Waterhouse, Executive Director of the Okoboji Community Foundation, which is an affiliate of the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines. We will have each of our speakers share their information in successive order and then open the call for participants to ask questions, or if you'd like to share your own learnings from conferences you've attended throughout the year, please feel free to do so as well. As a courtesy, please mute your phones while someone is talking and then obviously unmute to ask questions or if you want to add to the discussion. And also, please plan to identify yourself and your community foundation if you make any comments or questions so we know who is speaking. And with that, I will turn the call over to Carla to get us started. Carla?
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm Carla from the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation, and as Michelle mentioned, I attended the Council on Foundations conference that was called Inclusive Economic Prosperity. It was held in the Twin Cities at the end of August. Just a note that the Iowa Council of Foundations was one of the regional partners for this conference. So the goal of the conference was to bring grant makers together to talk about the factors that make up a healthy local and regional economy that is inclusive and promotes innovation. So the conference was really examining the question of what role can foundations play in creating a regional economic innovation ecosystem. And the conference was interesting to us because some of the different community projects that we're doing relate a lot to this. We've been engaged in a regional planning process for a multi-county area, but also we've been doing a lot of thinking about our local areas and in particular how we bring people into the people who are not participating fully in the economy, how we can help bring them into the economy so that the sort of wealth of the community is shared among everybody in the community and we can increase the equity of our communities. So that was sort of the driving force of what piqued our interest in the conference. So the conference had sort of 2 frameworks. One of them was learning. So a lot of background information was shared about the economic drivers of the Midwest and what constitutes an innovation ecosystem. And then a lot of time for idea exchange. So conversation with subject matter experts and peers on topics like community leadership, impact investing, resource alignment, and competitive talent development. So I'm going to first share that definition that we were using at the conference of what we meant by an inclusive economic ecosystem. So as we may experience in our own local communities, it's very typical for communities to view economic growth as a solution to unemployment and poverty. But one of the speakers, Bob Weisbord from RW Ventures and the Regional Growth Innovation Network, shared some information about what he termed the inclusive growth paradox. And this relates to research that shows, oh dear, I'm sorry, we have a train in the background, so I hope it doesn't get too loud. Some research that shows that the fact that places with the least inequity grow the fastest. So if we put that another way, I apologize about the train. If we put that another way, rapid economic growth actually often leads to increased inequity, which isn't what we initially think about when we think about helping our communities thrive. So this leads to a definition of inclusive economic prosperity as one where the wealth of a region increases and the inequity of a region decreases. So it doesn't suggest that anybody has to necessarily lose, but that those on the bottom end of the wealth scale will gain faster than those who are on the top. So as foundations try to address issues of poverty or low community wealth, it's important to work with economic development leaders in our communities to specifically identify programs that will promote economic inclusion. So then we moved on to talking about a number of ideas about how this can happen. So I will share a few of the ideas that came out of the conference. So one of the sort of topical areas that we talked about were different types of pipelines. So looking at targeted strategies that increase measurable productivity of populations that are not benefiting from the economy. And they showed examples of workforce, talent pipelines, innovation pipelines, and education pipelines. So I'll share two of these. So one of them was Dr. Jamie Bracey. She founded the Center for Inclusive Competitiveness at the College of Engineering at Temple University. And she's working on an education pipeline that acts as what she calls a cognitive accelerator for students of color. So they're reaching way back into elementary schools, middle schools, high schools to target students of color in their community who will then be part of the College of Engineering at Temple, and also just thinking about how they accelerate them into any kind of college track. So she was really fascinating. And then a woman named Isabel Chancellor spoke, and she works for the Neighborhood Development Center in St. Paul, which is I think a parallel to the kinds of economic development centers many of our communities may have. And they have created a structure for an equitable entrepreneurial pipeline. So they provide training at their center in 5 different languages. They engage in high-risk lending. They provide wraparound technical assistance and incubator space for what we would classify as non-traditional entrepreneurs. So in addition to pipelines, then, we talked about some foundation-specific programs that some of our presenters were working with closely. So one of them was the Aspen Institute, and they do a lot of investing in emerging workforce and in adult education. And another one was the Bush Foundation. They've got a community innovation grant process that funds community groups to identify new solutions to existing problems. They're looking for solutions that are more effective, equitable, and sustainable than what exists currently in those communities. Those are just a few of the examples. There were a lot of examples on that, but I was given 5 minutes, so I wanted to pick out ones that I thought, for me anyway, were ideas that I've kind of taken and tried to think about in the context of our local community. There was lots of time for peer discussion there, and then there were a number of models to investigate and people to talk to. So I'd be happy to follow up with anybody afterwards as well. So Michelle, I'll turn it over to the next speaker then.
Great. Thanks, Carla. That's really good information and a lot of thought-provoking topics there for us to think about. And then if anybody has questions at the end for Carla, we can certainly ask her those. So next we'll move to Anna, who's going to talk about her conference that she attended in May for the Grant Makers for Effective Organizations. Anna?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on the call today. So I was able to attend the Grant Makers for Effective Organizations conference in San Francisco in April, May, and it was a wonderful conference. And really the national conference is really designed to push participants to think critically about the changes they can make to their work to advance smarter grant-making practices through a lot of different session formats, plenary speakers, networking time, and informal conversations with peers, which I found just to be as incredibly helpful as much as many of the sessions were themselves. A big focus of this year's conference was really looking at how, hearing from grant maker and nonprofit speakers on topics related to the importance of being in relationship with the community as funders, and the necessity of racial equity and effective grant making, and how we can come together and to address those issues, and the work that we need to do as funders often when we're looked at to lead on those types of issues in our community. So it's hard to summarize everything that I took away in a short time, but I'm going to do my best. I tended to focus on our capacity building efforts and initiatives. That's the work that I'm most closely working with here in the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines, and a big focus that we have in general in our community. I had the opportunity to meet with several other foundations doing capacity building work. A colleague out of Washington State, and she's doing capacity building for their community foundation there, and an individual who's doing capacity building from Florida. And through our conversations, it's really one of the biggest takeaway is for me that nobody has this entirely figured out, and it is a constantly evolving process as we build the capacity of our organizations and our communities, and the importance of just going back to constantly being in communication with those that we serve to figure out how are we best serving them is a big takeaway that I think I always know, but it was just really important in those conversations to reiterate that, and just refreshing to understand that it's a constant process of just evaluating what we're doing and constantly having those conversations to make sure that we're truly meeting the needs that are out there. And just like we are, several of the colleagues that I talk to as well, it's constantly figuring out how, with the limited resources that we have, do we make the biggest impact in our communities and truly build the capacity of the sector. Some interesting takeaways I had from some of the sessions regarding capacity building work and ideas on how best to approach the work. I loved the idea, talked a lot about how we as grant program officers, how do we act with grant maker courage, and often that means standing up and really being able to speak out when we know that from the insights that we're hearing in our community, being willing to act with that courage to change our programs in ways that might not always be the sexiest types of investments that people are looking for us to make, and so being able to stand up and act with that grant maker courage when we know that we have the conversations and the data that we've taken in our partnerships and our learning to make those changes that are necessary to truly serve our communities in effective ways. The importance of staying in relationship with our grantees, the importance of keeping our capacity building funding simple and flexible, and that we as funders really need to keep that in mind about how are we being flexible, and how important that really is, and the importance in capacity building of creating opportunities for learning and exchange, both for us with our grantee partners, but also creating those opportunities for our grantees to come together and learn from one another in that peer relationship. Just as this call, we all know that how important it is for us to learn from our peers. That's really important to create those opportunities for our grantees as well to learn from each other. I also thought it was really interesting. There was a lot of talk around how do we create an organizational health index for capacity building grantees versus we talk a lot about what are the deliverables of projects, but how are we shifting our mindset to really look at how are we asking organizations to measure their increased health as an organization versus what are the deliverables that you're getting. So that was something that we're trying to think about here as we evolve our capacity building programs at the Community Foundation. How do we help nonprofits develop and design their own capacity building based on the needs that they have versus us being as prescriptive and outlining that for them? And I think this is in a really, this next one, really how are we partnering with nonprofits in a spirit of service, coming from a place of humility versus us having all the answers and outlining what they should know and all of those things. But how do we come from a place of humility and admitting we don't know what we don't know and asking them what their goals are, how does their board measure success, and then trying to determine how we can use their metrics of success as their goals for the projects that we're working on. Another big theme that was pretty evident throughout the entirety of the 3 days was really how do we as funders approach equity work in our communities. And that was a really powerful conversation and one that we've continued to noodle on here and really continue to think about. a lot of conversation and really, really understanding that we need to learn to recognize as funders our privilege in this work, and recognizing that philanthropy was created out of a place of privilege and power, and ultimately shaped by white culture. So what does that mean in our work in our communities, and recognizing that is there, and that was the history of how a lot of philanthropy was designed. Understanding that equity work is a marathon and not a sprint, so we as funders must be willing to do the hard work internally at our own organizations and in our own cultures before we can look and lead externally. Understanding that data is key in this work to understand where you are currently, or where you've been in the past in this work, and where you are going. And understanding that doing this work is really, really uncomfortable at times, but we must lean into the discomfort, because that is where the learning is truly happening and the change truly takes place. It was really interesting to be in conversation with other funders, looking at and trying to dissect the effectiveness of their equity work at their foundations, and understanding that often funders carry shame for not knowing how to lead in the space of equity, diversity, and inclusion, but really understanding that this work takes a lot of vulnerability on our part as funders, and admitting we don't know what we don't know, and going out as partners, and having the courage to admit that and be vulnerable in partnership with those that we are serving. I thought it was really interesting. There was a lot of talk around it's often not a values gap that we in foundations have, but it's an action gap. So how do we bridge that? And it's important for us as foundations to be doing our own internal training and reflection and work before we go out and, again, like I said, try to lead on these issues in the community. How are we as funders making sure that our support and our grant programs are not perpetuating inequities in our community was another really big conversation that we have. So are the organizations we're supporting, are they reflective of the communities that we're serving? Are we seeking new partners led by women and people of color? Is our application process accessible to nonprofits that may be in the greatest need of capacity building support? Those were all really interesting, reflective questions that we've continued to try to digest and look at once we've been back and looking at our programs and the accessibility of that. Also looking at when we are convening in the community and looking to have diverse voices around the table, I think this is something that is really easy to fall into, that we as funders often rely too much on charismatic executive director voices maybe in those communities of color, but this is not the same as hearing voices of those with lived experiences of those issues, and to not confuse the two. So really making sure when we are engaging the voices of those with lived experiences, we're truly engaging them in thoughtful ways, and not just going for the low fruit of those that we are in contact with and that are in our circles, but being thoughtful that we have the voices of the lived experiences at the table. And also really thinking about when we are, looking at the types of program officers we're engaging to lead this work in the community, that we need a different kind of program officer to be leaders on issues in the community, and need to place value on community experience as much as educational credentials. We need to really be thinking about how are we training our program officers to really look at the content of the applications that are coming in, and less on the typos and errors that might exist. Understanding that that's not necessary, that often is a way that we might dismiss organizations that are doing great work in the community and underserved communities. And so how are we approaching our lens of what's worthy of being funded and not, and evaluating our processes and that, and how we're not continuing to perpetuate those inequities. And finally, trust was just a huge theme throughout the conference. And really, how do we as funders start in a place of trust as a funder, and how are we granting trust to new organizations and organizations we might not have worked with as much in the past? A lot of talk about, how obviously trust is foundational to change, and that, change will really only happen at the pace of the trust that we're building in our community. So how are we as funders truly building that trust, but also granting that trust to organizations and partners that we're working with? So that was just a few of my notes. I think I'm probably over my time, but it was an incredibly thought-provoking conference, really just dynamic speakers and dynamic conversations with peers. And if anybody has the opportunity to attend a future GEO conference, I would really encourage them to do so. It is well worth the time and really helping to as a program officer at a foundation to really step back and say, okay, how are we effectively working with partners in our community and building community and effectively doing our work. So that's what I have.
Great. Thanks, Anna. That's really helpful, and I know it's hard to condense down into just a few bites there, but I appreciate that. That's a lot of good information. A lot of it kind of ties to some of the work that our members have been doing in the openness cohort, so it's kind of nice to see those connections there as well. And I know Carrie's starting to do some work on around equity too, and having some upcoming membership meetings on those topics, so it's nice to get some information on the front end on those topics, and then we'll continue to work on them throughout the new year. So thank you, Anna. So next we'll move on to Cindy Sweet, who's going to talk to us about her experiences at the National Conference for Growing Community Foundations. Cindy?
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, very good. Yes, this was my first opportunity. I'm the executive director of the Cedar Falls Community Foundation, and so this was the first Community Foundation conference that I had attended in this position. This conference was held in Wichita, and it was a very worthwhile conference. Just as by way of some background statistics, there were 37 states represented, 178 community foundations represented, 409 participants overall. I found very interesting the growth of this conference just in the past 3 or 4 years. The conference has literally doubled in size. Typically, the participants in this conference have assets under $500 million, although there were community foundations there that were much, much larger. And the majority of the positions represented, they gave us this wonderful graph so that we could understand, who was present in the room. The majority of the positions represented were CEOs, presidents, executive directors, followed closely by board members, program positions, finance positions, and so forth, but really all kinds of positions were represented. So this conference took place in October in Wichita. It's an annual conference. My understanding is that it's held always at the Marriott there. They already have their dates posted for next year. And I just found it very, very worthwhile. It was, I would describe it as kind of a foundational conference. Topics on a lot of different areas so that folks of all kinds of job descriptions would find something useful to them. They started on Sunday with what they called retreats, and then Monday, Tuesday, and Monday, Tuesday they had the breakout session. I wanted to share with you the CEO retreat in particular that I attended on Sunday afternoon. It was just very interesting. The speaker was Dr. Kathleen Allen, and she talked about looking beyond our mission and vision and trying to really articulate the purpose of our organization and how that purpose shapes our structure and process. And I think a lot of the folks in the room had a challenge kind of thinking beyond mission and vision, because that's usually what we focus on. So she had us in small groups at our tables, and she asked us to talk about the deep need or higher purpose that our organization has to meet and the power of our purpose in meeting that deep need. And when we discussed that in our small groups, it was just really surprisingly difficult for most CEOs to identify a higher purpose, because they were, and I include myself in that statement, very focused on our missions. As we discussed the need and the purpose of our organizations, she asked the folks present to think about their origin story and what the need was when our community foundation was formed, as a way to try to put in context where we came from and what we're doing now. She talked about the uniqueness of each community foundation, that each foundation is anchored in a community or an audience that it serves that is unique from all others, and that we really need to embrace that and serve that unique community. That was a message that several of the speakers had. When is it time to stop trying to grow and instead focus on service to our community, which I found interesting. When she talked about purpose, that was part of that presentation, that she said we need to stop thinking about raising money, which is, I think, difficult to do, and focus on identifying community needs, bringing people together to solve problems, and leveraging those intangible resources that are at our disposal as community foundations. She gave a kind of a definition of donors, which I thought was interesting, and I hadn't particularly thought of this before. She said that donors have active hope, that when they give to our foundations, they're assuming and hoping that our community foundations would still exist long into the future, so that we would be using the resources they have left to us to help transform our communities in positive ways, and that as we work with our donors and accept those gifts and assets into our community foundations, we need to be mindful of that mindset that the donors have. Her presentation really helped me think about what we do and why we do it in a different way that I found very, very interesting. Participants in the CEO retreat also received copies of her book, and several other books websites, blogs, all kinds of things were mentioned for further reading and education. So that was how I kicked off the conference, was by attending that CEO retreat the very first day, and I found it very useful. I found it inspiring to think about things in a different way, and it was really great to meet all the people around the table and listen to their stories and understand where they were coming from. So all in all, I would highly recommend the conference. It was very useful.
Great. Thanks, Cindy. That's helpful information. A lot of good things to think about there, and thinking in a different way than most of us have probably thought for a while in terms of the work of community foundations. So I'll turn it over to Rob Waterhouse, who's the Executive Director of the Okoboji Community Foundation. His organization is an affiliate of the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines, so he might have a slightly different perspective or attended some different sessions at the same conference that Cindy was at. So we'll hear from Rob now.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Good to be on the call, and thank you for setting this up. Excuse me. As Michelle just mentioned, I had an opportunity as well to participate in the Growing Community Foundations conference down in Wichita. And although I am here with the Okoboji Foundation up here in northwest Iowa, as Michelle also mentioned, we are an affiliate of the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines. So had an opportunity to road trip with my fellow foundation mates from Des Moines. Joe Sorensen was kind enough to let us all pile in a van that the foundation rented. So it was kind of neat from a team building perspective to drive down to Wichita and back with a good group of folks. For me, being new to community foundation work, I started with the Okoboji Foundation in April of this year, having spent my entire career in nonprofit working for a number of different nonprofit organizations. I had worked real closely with community foundations and applying for grants and identifying needs and et cetera. Being an employee of a community foundation is new for me. So at the conference, the sessions that were the most beneficial for me were the Community Foundation Basics, the 101 courses per se, both on Sunday and Monday. So I found those very good in the sense that it laid a good foundation of, how community foundations got started and how they fit into the overall nonprofit sector and that sort of thing. So that was a good day's worth of just the basics of foundation work. I also found that the planned giving breakout sessions were very, very helpful. The Okoboji Foundation, we're a small shop. We have 1.5 full-time employees. Of course, we have a very dedicated board of directors and numerous volunteers. So just coming up with ideas and strategies and tactics are revolving around how to build our planned giving, I thought was very, very beneficial. I would just say in general, anytime you get folks together at a conference, the networking that can happen and the relationships that you start and connect with and develop have all kinds of potential down the line, because this work is very satisfying, and it does so much good work in our communities. So just having those go-to people, if you need to place a phone call or ask perhaps a piece of information that you're not quite sure of how something fits together, the people that were at this conference, I think, will be very beneficial in the long run. So overall, I was very glad we went. I enjoyed it. I definitely gained a lot from it, and I look forward to attending another conference sometime in the future. So that's pretty much what I had to offer this morning.
Good. Thanks, Rob. I appreciate those comments, and I think you're right, and I think there was a theme through everybody's comments about the networking opportunities. When you're in a room with people and doing like work, it's always refreshing to hear what they're doing, and you can learn from others. So that is definitely a positive that everybody, I think, benefits from attending conferences. So thank you. So next we'll just open it up for anybody that has questions for any of the speakers or comments, or if anybody has a conference shareback they would like to share with the group as well. I'll just open it up now for anyone to have a question or comment.
Hi, everybody. This is Elizabeth with the Community Foundation Northeast Iowa. Just curious, with a poll of the speakers, if these are like annual conferences that as an organization you budget for and make sure to get to as far as professional development, if it's, you're seeking out funding so you can attend these, just kind of looking at your conference attendance strategy for every year.
Thanks, Elizabeth. This is Michelle. I'll just have the speakers just go in order that you spoke to answer Elizabeth's question so we don't end up talking over each other. So I'll have Carla answer first, and then you can go from there.
Sure. So I would preface this by saying that we are a host foundation, so we've got more assets than some of the smaller community foundations, so obviously that plays into what you're able to attend for conferences. We do try to budget for everybody to attend the conferences that are appropriate or need to go to. So for our sort of externally facing development and program staff, that's usually, we try to be able to send everybody to one away conference a year if possible. It doesn't always work out for individuals, and we don't every year always have the budget for that, but that's our intention each year. We do a number of different conferences. So the one that I went to about inclusive economic prosperity was a standalone conference that the Council of Foundations did. This is not a repeating conference that they do every year. The conference that I usually attend every year is one that's put on by the Funders Network. We're a member of the Funders Network, and as a member, the conference itself is free, although the travel and the lodging is not, so that still adds up to a sizable amount. Our development staff the last couple of years has been going to the Growing Community Foundations Conference in Kansas. We've had staff attend the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations conferences, and the Council of Foundations is now down to a an every other year conference schedule, but we very often had at least one person attend the Council on Foundations conference. So it depends on the person and the role, but yeah, the different conferences that people mentioned today are ones that we have found very valuable as well.
And this is Anna with the Community Foundation, and I would echo a lot of the previous comments. We really base ours is based on professional development dollars. So every year, we're scouring to kind of see what we as individuals here at the Community Foundation would propose as being helpful learning opportunities for us. And it can be a lot of different things. It can be conferences. It can be budgeting for, making trips to other community foundations that we can learn from and having that peer exchange. It can be a variety of different things. But, we really look at it as how, whatever conference we're looking to attend, being able to articulate how does that relate back to the current, issues and things that we're looking at. And so for us, the GEO conference was very timely as we're looking at more and more to lead in our community on conversations around equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how does that trickle over into our grant making practices and just, from a program officer perspective, being able to mix and mingle and learn from other peers who are doing this work, and GEO in particular has a strong focus on effective capacity building, and we were looking at revising and the next iteration and evolution of our capacity building program. So the timing was right for that conference for me to attend in that way as I was looking to make those proposed changes as we move forward. But I would say, it isn't an every year that thing where it's like every year I'm going to that conference. It's more so how does it relate to some of the current challenges and things that we're facing, and looking at how do we supplement, because conferences are expensive and they're not always, you're not always able to go. And so how are we supplementing with other more local opportunities such as ICOF and other peer calls and things like that and ways to engage. So, so I would say that it's more on an annual basis. GEO does a number of different conferences every year. Their national conference, I believe, is every other year, and then they have a learning conference and a couple of other things in the off years that are smaller. So the one I attended was the national conference that they do every other year. But lots of great resources out there and opportunities to get engaged both at that national level but also local level.
This is Cindy. I think that professional development on an annual basis is really important, no matter what industry we work in. So we did not have a line item in our budget for professional development this year, and I asked the board to support me going to this conference, and they did. And I've asked them to include a line item in the budget going forward for professional development. It may not always be used for the Wichita conference. It could be used for any number of different learning opportunities. But I just think it's really important for an organization to budget for that and support their staff in those professional development opportunities.
And this is Rob of the Okoboji Foundation. One of the beauties of being an affiliate is we worked real closely with Des Moines on budgeting for this conference. And if I'm not mistaken, there was a grant that was applied for that helped offset some of the costs. And I apologize, I don't know exactly where those dollars came from. But just like with anything in operations, professional development and conferences and travel is something that our foundation has put money into and aside for. So, I just think if it's, a reasonable dollar amount and if the person attending can justify the expense, I think most board of directors, they're all business owners or professionals or have done professional type conferences in their line of work as well. So it's not a tough sell, so to speak. But anytime you can get an opportunity to gather and learn about best practices or trends or learn from experts in particular areas within community foundation work, I think it's always well worth the time and the money to do so.
Good, thanks. I would just mention, Rob, you had mentioned the grant that the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines had received, and you wouldn't have known this because you weren't in your position at the time, but they did apply for Iowa Council of Foundations capacity building grant in the spring to help fund some professional development opportunities like the going to the Kansas conference. So I'll just remind everybody on the call of that, those capacity building grants that we do in the fall and spring, one of the components is professional development. So if you're thinking about planning for conferences for next year, there will be the spring cycle that you could seek funding for some professional development opportunities. So I'll open it back up if there's any other questions.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
This is Carrie with
go ahead, Carrie.
I just wanted to share a couple updates from some meetings I've attended this fall as it relates to our community foundations work. We have been participating with 3 Iowa community foundations in the Funders Network's prep cohort around disaster philanthropy for community foundations. And we had several learnings last week in our convening in Oklahoma City. And several of those things will be integrated into our Iowa Community Foundation Disaster Philanthropy Toolkit that was released at the Connect conference this year. So look for more information on that in our upcoming CS Snapshot e-newsletters. We're going to have a refreshed version of that toolkit available. A couple things to highlight in particular is the importance of partnering with your local legal aid. Iowa Legal Aid is a statewide organization, but there's typically a local office that serves your community or your region. And one of the presenters just said in disaster response and recovery work, there's just some things that attorneys have to do. So strengthening those relationships on the front end before a disaster strikes is critically important. And the other thing is we secured a resource from one of our colleagues in Minnesota that details state and federal funding sources for mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. So we are going to update that to be an Iowa resource, and we'll include that in the toolkit as well. So more to come there. I also had the opportunity to participate in a meeting with regional associations like ICOF and national philanthropy serving organizations like GEO and GSER a few weeks ago, and it was focused specifically on the services that are being provided to community foundations. And one of the things I took away from that is thinking mostly about the role of the Council of Foundations and how they're supporting community foundation legal practices and policy work. With the announcement of Kathleen Enright being appointed to the CEO position, I think that there will be a lot shifting in the council's space and in how they're working with other partners in the state and region and nation. So I'm really excited about that and heard a little bit more about her vision on a call last week as she steps into that new role in 2019. So there could be some more community foundation offerings coming specifically from the council in the year ahead. And I think I'll leave it at that, Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. Appreciate those. I think we'll just say thank you to our speakers today, Carla, Anna, Cindy, and Rob, for sharing it with us their conference learnings. And as a reminder, a full listing of the topics and recordings of this and past PLCs can be found by logging on to our website, and then you click on the Community Foundations tab, and then under that you'll click on CF links to access those. Our PLC series will resume in the first quarter of 2019, so please look for information about it in the December CF Snapshot e-newsletter. And thank you again for joining us on this call, and I hope you all have a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.